There was an odd filmmaking trend during the 1980s. Take a classic or not so classic, probably corny horror flick from the 50s and remake it into something incredible. The most iconic of these remakes was probably John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982, a remake of the film The Thing from Another World from 1951 directed by Christian Nyby, but there is also David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986, a remake of Kurt Newman's The Fly from 1958, and Chuck Russell's The Blob from 1988, which is of course a remake of the film with the same name from 1958 by Irvin S. Yeworth Jr. And maybe there's more I'm unaware of. Who knows? I'm not 80s old. But these are certainly the most prominent examples. Hell, if you want to stretch the timeline a little, you could argue that the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers got this trend started early, so maybe that's worth noting too. Regardless, I find it interesting that all these hyper-specific genre remakes with so similar an end goal, making an effects-driven body horror spin on an old movie, all happened to come out around the same time. So I thought I'd take a close look at all the movies I just mentioned, examine what each was about and the reasons for their creation, and see if I can't tell if this was an inspired trend or a standalone complex. Sound good? Good. Let's go through these in chronological remake order, starting with The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing is probably the best known of these remakes and probably films in general, but that doesn't mean the original should be ignored. The 1951 film The Thing from Another World, theoretically based on the novella Who Goes There by John W. Campbell, can today best be described as quaint. We'll return to the novella in a bit, but for now, this first film adaptation is most easily summed up as, what if Frankenstein's monster, but not really, and also it's very cold.
Care to join us?
Oh, wait till I count my fingers. I may have lost one.
The film is about a fast-talking team of U.S. Air Force members and scientists at a research station in the North Pole who discover a crashed UFO and immediately blow it up, because of course they do. And then they bring back, frozen in an ice block, a survivor from the crash, an alien who of course breaks loose and is definitely not Frankenstein. Don't worry, it's definitely not that. Trust me, it's made out of plants.
The original Thing didn't have much to do with the original short story,
Right.
is that right?
It was a monster like Frankenstein was a monster.
So you decided to go back to that.
Let's go back to the short story and explore it. I thought it had never been really told.
There's a mad scientist who is clearly completely insane for not wanting to immediately kill the Thing, and a down-to-earth, no-nonsense romantic captain who wants to do what's right and kill the Thing, but he has to wait on those darn orders to come from HQ through the storm, and then they do kill it. Cue ominous dialogue. The end.
Watch the skies. Everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
Rewatching it today, I have to wonder whether this film is only noteworthy because of its legendary remake. Like, it was a perfectly fine movie, perfectly watchable and compelling enough in its own right, but nothing I'm going to be dying to revisit anytime soon. It does have maybe two elements I find noteworthy from a storytelling or filmmaking perspective. One is its use of sometimes humorous, fast-paced, overlapping dialogue. Characters are constantly talking over each other, and while you, of course, can't make out what everyone is saying, not that you're meant to, it does help sell the illusion that these are real panicked people trying to figure out what the hell is going on.
By computing the difference, it becomes quite obvious.
The other noteworthy thing is this one scene from later in the film. Just take a look. I just find that incredible from the perspective of, you know, how the hell did they even pull that off in 1951 without killing anybody? Look at that, they just straight up set a dude on fire in a small room where the fire could easily spread, and they just kept doing it. Like, I feel bad for the guy in the monster suit, but damn, was that a nice scene. But aside from that, I struggle to identify anything particularly noteworthy about this film. Much of the intrigue of the story it was adapting was seemingly lost in translation. Translation being a loose word there. Campbell's original novella honestly bears more similarity to something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers thematically than the actual first film adaptation. Campbell's story, much like Body Snatchers, is about paranoia, about the fear of your neighbor, your friend, everyone you know suddenly turning into something, well, Alien. I'm not saying the novella is a masterpiece that needs to be revered or anything, mind you. In actuality, its writing left something to be desired. The huge blowtorch Macready had brought coughed solemnly. Abruptly, it rumbled disapproval throatily. Then it laughed gurglingly. But still, it was a compelling enough idea that it apparently warranted a film adaptation. And basically, only the vaguest plot elements were kept from Campbell's story for the 51 film. It's in a cold place, and the monster is from a UFO and gets unfrozen, and that's it. In comparison to the novella's monster, which assimilates and imitates all beings it comes into contact with, the movie monster really just does look like a Frankenstein, and in making that change, the film loses all the paranoia that was at the heart of the original story, and in its place, it gives us some comedic, anti-science fear-mongering and American military dick-sucking. Why that change was made, I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say maybe the gnarly body horror imagery conjured by the novella was either too complicated to film or thought to be too much for film audiences at the time. Luckily, that's what the remake is for. John Carpenter's The Thing is much more faithful to the source material and is also the grimmest and most gruesome possible take on it. The only real holdover from the 51 film is the title card and a little imagery here and there. But otherwise, Carpenter's version is an entirely different beast. It preserves the nature of the creature from the novella and thus carries over and then amplifies that paranoia that made the original work. And this film's praises have been sung to death, and I probably couldn't add much more to those praises if I tried, but damn, this is a fine movie. The score is iconic, the practical effects work is top-notch, the actors' increasingly frantic performances do an excellent job of selling you on that sweet, sweet paranoia, and that beautiful, ambiguous ending lets the narrative end on just the right note, having said all it wanted to say while leaving viewers with a couple of nagging questions that have kept them talking for years, even if the answers to those questions don't matter. All in all, this film is just, mwah, it's perfect.
Why don't we just wait here for a little while? See what happens.
So with all of that said, why a remake? What about this story drove this creative team to go in this hard?
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Part of it was an admiration for the craft of the 51 film. In an interview in Starlog magazine, cinematographer Dean Cundy said, "I knew that most movies like it, made in that era, were done very quickly and inexpensively, but it was very polished and had so much style. The fact that there was a great deal of overlapping dialogue and the photography was very well done showed that a lot of care had been put into it, and a lot of talent was displayed there. I also appreciated that they took the trouble to do something we also took a great deal of trouble to do, which was to show the breath coming out of the actors' mouths as they talked in cold areas. Narrative hiccups aside, the original was still a technical feat, and the remake's filmmakers loved that about it and wanted to do it justice. Another major motivator behind the production, to hear the director say it, was a desire to portray the original novella's paranoia.
Really, our concern was about the paranoia aspects of the story.
It was such a great story about that, wasn't it? 12 guys and finally getting and knowing each other so well, and then finally getting to a point where you don't know.
The original short story was called Who Goes There? And I think that sort of sums up the idea. Are you human or who are you? And
it was an intimate story. It was such a, wasn't it? I mean, it was such a small, intimate story that...
it was a story about claustrophobia. The paranoia is the glue that holds the movie together. It's, of course, I think the most disturbing thing for the audience. That's what bothered them so much. And I always felt the characters reflected their time just as Hawks's original movie, his characters reflected theirs.
In the end product, that core theme of paranoia shines through, a departure from the 51 film and a faithful reflection of the original novella. One of Carpenter's favorite quotes from the film sums it up best.
Trust's a tough thing to come by these days.
You would think that any film with a premise like a scientist invents a teleporter and accidentally becomes part fly would be rife with cheese. And while I can't say it's entirely lacking in cheese, the 1958 film The Fly, based on a short story of the same name, is a shockingly compelling watch. In an odd parallel to the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers film. Pause the video. Let me explain myself. I realize I keep bringing up Body Snatchers here. I originally watched the two versions of Body Snatchers, 50s and 78, with the intent of also including them in this video, but then I thought, too much work and it's outside the timeline anyway. But they're both good movies, definitely watch them. Anyway, back to the video. The main action, the part with the human fly hybrid, is framed as a flashback. Thus, the film presents itself as a sort of prestige murder mystery first and foremost, and only later shows its more kooky sci-fi quirks. From the outset of 1958's The Fly, we know who done it. A scientist was killed by his wife with a hydraulic press. The question then becomes, why done it? And while the police and the dead man's brother try to coax an answer out of her, the wife shows signs of obsession and desperation whenever she hears the buzzing of a fly. Eventually, she does reveal why. Her genius hubby invented a teleporter, then tested it on himself, but accidentally got himself mixed up with a fly. He felt himself losing control, but before he did, he destroyed his own research, made his wife swear to destroy the mutated fly that had escaped, and had her kill him with the press. In no short order, the brother and a policeman do manage to find the mutated fly, destroy it, and swear to never speak of this shit again. The end. You know, before we talk about the rest of the film, man, that fucking ending, though. Before I went into this whole project, I thought I was building up a tolerance for horror. I'm someone who's generally a complete scaredy cat and can't handle most scary stuff for the life of me, but also I'm able to watch, The Thing and be like, haha, cool special effects, bro, I appreciate the filmmaking craft. So I thought, hey, maybe I don't scare so easy after all. But then, haha, lol, nope. The ending of this film happened, and by the gods, I could not help but avert my eyes from the horror in front of me, for that was too much to handle. Despite the fact that by today's standards, the special effects on display in the climax of The Fly are horribly dated and even laughable, watching it in the moment, having already been fully invested in the film, the quality of the effects did not matter in the fucking slightest. What mattered was that I was already fully invested in the story, so all they really needed to do was successfully visualize the idea of what was happening. Looking good be damned, and damn was it effective. Visual effects may be an important filmmaking tool, but this just goes to show that they aren't the be-all end-all. When backed up by a good story, so long as the effects are clear enough in their intent, then that can be enough. It sure was enough to give me nightmares, I'll tell you what. You want to know why I'm not showing that footage on screen? Because I don't want to see that shit again, that's why. Anyway, aside from the nightmare fuel, it's amazing just how compelling and well executed this story about a silly sci-fi murder is. Maybe some of that has to do with the film heavily back-ending its weirder stuff. For example, the visual reveal of what actually happened to the scientist only occurs this deep into the movie. But still, it's a rare film that can make you tense up from the mere sound of a fly buzzing. Every actor turns in a good performance, from Vincent Price's concerned and caring Francois Delambre. I definitely did not pronounce that right, and I'm not pronouncing any of this shit right, I am sorry. Elder brother of the deceased scientist, to David Hedison's charismatic portrayal of said scientist, Andre Delambre. Andre Delambre, that fucking rhymes. Damn. But of particular... I am getting sidetracked as fuck. But of particular note is Patricia Owens' portrayal of Helene Delambre, Andre's wife. Owens had to run the whole gambit of emotions for this one, and it's through her that we really feel an escalating sense of paranoia and desperation, such that when she goes on a manic hunt in the back half of the film for a fly, you really believe that something as simple as a fly could mean the difference between life and death. Like the ending, taken out of context, a scene that's about a woman going crazy trying to catch a single fly would seem silly, but because the actors and the script have done the legwork to justify everything, you can't help but lean in, keep your ears alert for the faintest buzz. Now, there are two ways in which you can definitely tell this film is dated. One is one single line by one single actor, and the other is its thematic alignment. That one single horribly dated line is this:
"She changed her mind. You know how women are."
Thematically, the film presents itself as a sort of cautionary tale about the hubris of man, science gone wrong. Helene is portrayed as the down-to-earth, sensible one, the voice of reason who fails to rein in the mad ambition of her genius scientist husband.
Electronics, rockets, Earth satellites, supersonic flight. And now this. Everything's going so fast, I'm just not ready to take it all in. It's all so quick.
I think Andre does make one startlingly prescient point.
Just do like Philippe does. Accept them as part of our normal life. They're facts. Wonderful facts.
In other words, relatively new technology that seems weird and alien to the olds just seems normal and a part of life to the kids who grew up with them, which is the lived experience of many young people today. But aside from that, the film seems to fall back on that kind of conservative, don't do science too much angle. Well, to be fair, the film's not an outright rejection of progress. It recognizes that as a silly idea, but it still can't help but want to wax poetic about playing God, so it can't really commit to either angle. It's more nuanced than a simple yes or no, but can't risk alienating any of the audience with committal. It wants to have its cake and eat it too.
He was searching for the truth. He almost found a great truth. But for one instant, he was careless.
That's what killed him?
Search for the truth is the most important work in the whole world and the most dangerous.
This is the kind of film where if Ian Malcolm were in it, he'd be telling you to, no, stop, don't do that. That's bad, what you're doing. Speaking of Ian Malcolm, the remake stars Jeff Goldblum.
Listen, maybe this is a bad idea.
Oh, it's too late. You've already seen them. Can't let you leave here alive.
David Cronenberg's The Fly from 1986 has a few notable major deviations from the original film, both in the narrative and visual effects department. On the narrative front, the remake ditches the murder mystery framework that leaves you wondering what happened for most of the runtime, and instead devotes the runtime to showing you every sickening detail of exactly what happens. It also ditches most of the poetic waxing about the nature of progress and what have you, and instead wisely uses its time building a relationship between Goldblum's Seth Brundle and Geena Davis's Veronica Quaife, creating an emotional core that drives the narrative forward and lets us better feel the tragedy at the heart of the story, that of a man who is loved being transformed into something unrecognizable, and the one who loves him having to destroy what he's become. And then there's the effects angle, of course, where we get to see each step of Seth's slow and increasingly hideous transformation as it plays out, instead of hiding him under a sheet for the bulk of his transformation and then revealing that he's just got a cartoon fly mask on. While nothing that the film displays conceptually terrifies me to anywhere near the degree of that last scene in the original film, the creature effects on display here are nonetheless staggering and completely disgusting, which is just the way I like it. One could perhaps accuse this film of not being as curious or contemplative as the original, and I would agree with that assessment, but it more than makes up for that with its emotional resonance and visual spectacle, all of which makes it a darn fine film. So, that being said, why did The Fly get remade?
When Stuart Kornfeld came to me and said, you know, we're at Fox, and Fox has the rights to The Fly, and we should remake The Fly. And I said, you're stupid. It's the dumbest movie ever made. Help me, help me. He said, no, metamorphosis. I said, oh, he doesn't know what's happening to him. Happens over a period of time. I said, that's a good idea. Stuart, that's a good idea. I'll pay you. I'm going to pay you for that. And I hired him to make The Fly with me.
Yes, just in case you were confused, that is the Mel Brooks, funny comedy ha-ha man, the man who, among many things, is famously known for saying this.
Don't be stupid, be a smarty. Come and join the Nazi party.
That guy was an executive producer on David Cronenberg's The Fly. There's no point here. I just thought that was incredible and worth sharing.
I said, well, who directs this, Stuart? He said, David Cronenberg.
For director Cronenberg, part of the motivation to make this film appears to be a fascination with the original concept, but dissatisfaction with the original execution.
The original story of The Fly was not really a great story in the sense of the quality of its writing, but it did have that basic concept that is so stunning. For a little story, for a sort of awkwardly written little story, it certainly had a huge impact when it came out and spawned quite a few movies and will probably spawn a few more before it's done.
The clearest difference between the original and his version, the change that he was most passionate about seeing through, was having the scientist talk throughout the course of the transformation.
Once again, the whole emotional push for me for the film was that Seth be articulate about what he's feeling. And so here we see it developed in terms of the relationship between himself and his lover journalist. She pushes him to articulate, to not keep it inside, the emotional response to things. And then later, he does it on his own when he becomes the Brundlefly. I needed to have words from him all the time.
Coupled with the film's other focus on fleshing out Seth and Veronica's relationship, we can see that part of the aim of this film was to bring out the emotional and human tragedy inherent in the concept of the fly that previous versions didn't go far enough with. Cronenberg also took issue with the hokiness of the science in both the original short story and the first film adaptation.
It always bugged me, if I can make the pun, that in the original, the fly's head was human-sized, or actually fit over a human's head, of course, because there was no scientific or logical reason why, if the head swap happened, that the fly's heads should suddenly be bigger. There was no rationale for that worked for me. There was no way to make that. And even as a kid, seeing the movie in 1957, which I did, that always bothered me. There were two things that bothered me. One was the proportions of the fly head. There was no way it could be big instead of just fly size. And the second thing was there was a famous shot that's the fly's point of view, and it was a mosaic. It was identical shots of his wife, sort of 100 of them. The fly looking at his screaming wife. That was also wrong, because as a junior entomologist, as I was at the time, I knew that that's not the way flies saw. The idea is that there's no functional value to a repetition of the same image. That doesn't help an insect at all. So it was wrong. It was scientifically wrong, and it didn't make any sense, and that bugged me too as a kid. I was determined that we would not make those kind of mistakes. That there would be no kids like me watching my version of the fly who would say, yeah, but that's not the way insects, whatever. The rethinking of the movie as being a gradual transformation because of the fusing of the DNA of the fly and the DNA of Brundle meant that I could would avoid sort of the crude errors that, as I thought of them when I saw the original Fly.
Thus, part of the motivation in making this film was to incorporate a more modern understanding of genetics, of the building blocks of life, to visualize what would happen if that got toyed with. Finally, he made a very conscious choice to avoid the first film's conservative leanings with regard to science and progress.
The question of technology and science and morality and ethics is often raised in my movies, and there has been, of course, the kind of romantic concept of going too far, that you cannot assault the gods. I don't really believe in destiny per se, but I think that it is innate in our nature to constantly change everything, to question everything, to try to understand everything. It will inevitably create good and bad, and I don't think there's any stopping it. I think we have to just accept that that is what our destiny is, to do all those things, to change everything, to try to control everything, and also to fail at it in terms of the big picture. I think it's a constant struggling, a constant striving. It's when things go wrong that you understand the nature of what happens when things go right. So I'm not really trying to promote a conservative approach to science or to art at all.
In sum, it seems to me that the intent behind this remake was to tap into what the director saw as the story's untapped emotional potential. And all those cool special effects were just kind of a bonus, the best possible way to bring out that new emotional core.
Help me.
Finally, and certainly the silliest sounding of the bunch, we have The Blob. Of every set of films I've covered in this video, The Blob is the most interesting in that the original isn't that good, so it's a wonder it got a top-tier remake to put it in the same Hall of Fame as these other films. I might have seemed kind of down on the 1951 version of The Thing earlier, but if I was forced to pick between watching one of the two over and over, give me The Thing from Another World any day of the week, because 1958's The Blob is... Okay, I'd be lying if I said it was a total snooze fest, because it's not, but among this whole set of horror flicks, it's the closest thing to. Being a cult film that earned an awesome remake, it surely has to have some enticing qualities, but it's harder to find them in this film than in all the others. The original The Blob, no joke, peaks with the opening credits and its iconic theme song.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor.
I unironically love that. But from there, it's all downhill. The film stars a 28-year-old Steve McQueen who looks closer to 38, playing a teenager called Steve, who has just about as much personality as you would imagine based solely on that description. Steve's out for a pleasant romantic drive with his girlfriend, while on the other side of town, a meteor crashes into the woods and brings with it some goo that latches onto an old man's hand, and good old Steve kindly drives the man over to the local doctor. Off-screen, the goo grows into a blob and eats the old man and the doctor, and then Steve and his friends run around town trying to convince the police and the townsfolk of the danger while the blob goes around eating people off-screen, and then the blob grows so big it bursts out of a theater in the film's most, and perhaps only, iconic scene, and then Steve and a few others hide in a diner's basement while the town comes together and blasts the blob with fire extinguishers until it gets too cold and decides to take a nap. Throw in a quick climate change warning, and that's that.
They're flying it to the Arctic. It's not dead, is it? No, it's not. Just frozen. I don't think it can be killed, but at least we've got it stopped. Yeah, as long as the Arctic stays cold, huh?
If this movie's about anything aside from the obvious, the title character, which it doesn't showcase a whole lot of, then it's about community, about a small town learning to come together, trust one another, and work together for the greater good. The cops learn there's more to these gruff teenagers than meddling brats. The teens learn that the cops actually do have hearts, which is clearly factually incorrect, but whatever. In looking around trying to figure out what made this film so iconic in its time, I came across this incredible little tidbit on a blog post promoting a book of memoirs about the film, which states that the director was using this movie to raise funds to make evangelical movies, which, like, holy shit, that evangelical lens did not come through at all. Unfortunately, I can't actually find a copy of that book anywhere, but if someone has a copy or a PDF or something, let me know what juicy tidbits it has, because I'm kind of mad that I can't read it. Anyway, what else about this relatively limp film could have captured hearts and minds? The only real possibility I can think of is the creature itself, but if it did, it probably did so more conceptually than practically, because while the name blob is silly, it's still a creepy concept. Like, if an amorphous blob was just going to absorb and digest you, the fuck you gonna do about it? All you can do is give up and die, and that has a lot of creep factor. But this was a Hays Code era film that was aiming for a broad audience, apparently Christian, somehow. So it couldn't make the best use of its scare potential by showing the blob actually attacking anyone on screen, so instead it pulls people off camera to implies that it eats them, and otherwise just oozes around. Honestly, it's more comical than anything, and when the blob's not around, which accounts for much of the thankfully short 86-minute runtime, the film instead just has lots of scenes of characters you don't care about just talking, maybe arguing a little.
Hi there, Mr. Police, there's a blob. I don't believe you.
Do you care that this one cop is playing chess? No? Anyway, in sum, the original Blob. The theme's a bop, it's got a cool premise, but in the end, it's a load of missed potential. The remake drops the theme song, but in its place, it employs gnarly practical effects to deliver on the full promise of that original premise. The 1988 version of The Blob is just a satisfying film to watch on every single level. Following a script by director Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont, which, unlike its predecessor, understands and makes full use of the concept of setup and payoff, the film right away lets you know you're in for a good time when it immediately kills off its version of the Steve McQueen character with an effects shot so savage that it would have gotten the film banned from distribution had it been released in '58, and instead chooses to follow not Steve's girlfriend and a gruff biker dude as the Blob goes on an increasingly violent murder sprees.
We made it actually scary by killing the Steve McQueen character off early. And while there's a risk to that, I know that's how you make things scary.
The film is the superior one in every single aspect, no exceptions. Aside from a couple of janky composite shots in the finale, the effects work is absolutely insane. Gory as all hell and incredibly fun to watch play out. The film actually puts effort into making you care about the main characters and uses this wild new writing tool called character arcs to help them change and grow over the course of the film.
Come on! You can do better than that!
So that by the end, you're wildly cheering them on as they fight against this impossible creature, as opposed to shaking yourself awake while some characters you don't care about hide in the basement. There's never a dull moment with this movie. It's exciting, comedic, just overall an incredibly satisfying watch that's easily recommendable to anyone who can stomach some gross body horror. So with all that said, we still have that eternal question. Why remake it? Why remake The Blob? Well, it seems that there was at least some desire to take the concept of the Blob and apply it to fears contemporary to the 80s. You know, fears like government bad.
This biohazard twist was such a product of the 80s at the time, too, when everyone was, afraid of nuclear holocaust and Chernobyl and, toxic waste.
This is more my distrust of authority. Yeah.
But the fact that the Blob was not an alien anymore, it was created by the government.
Yeah, that's correct.
That twist, again, being in the theater and feeling everyone go, oh, shit. It's a conspiracy.
It's worse than I thought.
When did that come up in the writing process?
That was the very beginning for me.
Yeah.
That was like something I knew I wanted to go for.
The Blob came out in a time of government mistrust, which was at an all-time low at the start of the 80s, following the likes of Watergate and the end of the Vietnam War, and while it experienced a slight resurgence during the 80s, it would only plummet again in the years after the film's release. I'm not implying causation here, though that would be funny. I'm just saying that the filmmakers aimed to reflect a very real contemporary mistrust of government, a view that has sadly not aged poorly.
They're expendable.
What else went into this remake? The filmmakers loved the innate horror of the Blob.
There's something that's kept the concept of the Blob alive for all these years and made the first one terrific. It is evil, and there is such a thing in nature, and they don't give a shit who you are.
What's great and timeless about the Blob is its lack of personality, but this sense of unstoppable evil. And the idea is, if it starts the size of your fist and grows to the size of the house, it'll never stop. It can never be reasoned with.
However, they also desired to visualize that horror through all the best visual effects they could manage, and they spend no shortage of time in commentaries and interviews just gushing about all that.
One of the common jokes about the original Blob was, oh, here comes the grape jelly coming out of the strawberry jam. Here it comes after us.
That's pretty grody looking right there.
One thing worth noting is that, according to the director, this film was greenlit in part due to the success of the remake of The Fly.
I was looking to get that directing break, and Mark Irwin, sitting right beside us, had done The Fly with Cronenberg and proved that a really kitschy film about a human fly could become a great classic. I thought, let me take The Blob to its furthest extent.
So, remakes begetting more remakes might sound reasonable and even normal by today's standards, but at the time it was a risk and one that did not pay off. History has been kinder to the remake of The Blob than critics and box office numbers at the time, which, as you can imagine, were, distinctly not kind. I think the film's staying power can be evidenced by the fact that it's still getting released today and modern reviews are generally friendly.
I love this movie. I've forgotten how much I love it.
In this recent rewatch, I realized it's pretty much a perfect movie. From a structure standpoint, from a script standpoint.
Writer Megan Navarro from Bloody Disgusting called it one of the greatest horror remakes of all time. This stands in stark contrast to contemporary reviews. One New York Times writer said, for reasons having nothing to do with merit, the 1958 film earned a place in history. The remake, enterprising as it is, won't do the same.
Are you sure about that?
So what did we learn? I started this project curious about how all these specific types of movies came to be at around the same time. And after all is said and done, I think there's certainly some common threads linking these movies together. For one thing, these remakes represent a sort of nostalgia for the films that were being remade and the time period they were from. The filmmakers behind the remakes all grew up around the same time, watching the movies that were popular then, and when they grew up and it was time for them to make their own films, they couldn't help but want to revisit some childhood classics. Between the remakes, there was also a somewhat consistent desire to update the narratives to reflect more contemporary fears. The Blob with the whole anti-government thing, The Thing in its update on the source material's Capgras delusion, and The Fly using its time's improved understanding of genetics to imagine the worst-case scenario. And then there's also the possibility that these remakes just influenced each other. We know for certain that the Blob remake was greenlit in part due to the success of the Fly remake. Perhaps The Fly itself was also following in The Thing's footsteps, though that's just speculation on my part. There was also an undercurrent of, dare I say, hubris among the remake's creators, a common appreciation for the source material, but an attitude like, yeah, I can do better. And, I mean, they did, so, no judgment from me. I can't say for certain that any of these films definitely came from one single place, but I can say for certain that they were all born from and reflect a love of filmmaking, of horror, and of absolutely gnarly special effects. And they will always stand as a testament to the ability of the horror film to simultaneously gross you out and enrapture you. Thanks for sitting through my ramblings about some nearly 40-year-old movies. Comment your thoughts if you have any. I realize this will probably be my least viewed video in years, but whatever. I wanted to do it. I should probably do another Magical Girl thing soon. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and don't forget to be gay and do crimes.